Hey, greetings, everyone. This is Chester Moore here, and I just dropped a new episode of my podcast, Dark Outdoors, and it's about feral humans. Have you ever heard of the topic of feral humans? The feral human thing is gaining a lot of steam, and there are a lot of people who think some of the disappearances happening in national forests, national parks, and in wilderness areas could be the act of feral humans. So, what would a feral human be? It would essentially be someone who has gone over to wildness, someone who is living in the wild, not living under human rules, someone who has grown up. You hear of stories of people raised with wolves and stuff like this. So, someone who literally is feral, born in the wild, raised in the wild, put in the wild, that lives as a wild thing. Now, there have been instances before of feral humans in history, but this is not the deep dive on that. We'll do something on that later on. I want to talk about what's on my Dark Outdoors podcast. So, a friend of mine named Rob Riggs wrote a book called On the Trail of the Wild Man, and it talked about the Bigfoot reports in the Big Thicket region. And, while that was interesting in its own right, something that years ago caught me about his book was the mention of what essentially would be almost like feral humans. He put that there were reports of Indians, like, and that's the words he used, you know, Native American, First Nation, undiscovered people in the Big Thicket. And in Trinity Bay. Actually, the most reports were from Trinity Bay, but there are also reports from the Big Thicket. And so if you subscribe to my Dark Outdoors podcast, you'll get that. It's out today. You can go to any podcasting platform that you listen to. It is not here on YouTube right now, but we are going to go into a clip here that I'm going to read from On the Trail of the Wild Man. And he talks about this person who was a surveyor and went into this area in Trinity Bay, and a game warden encountered him. He said, quote, "The game warden noticed that he was not carrying hunting or fishing equipment and asked where he was going. When Rick told him, the game warden asked Rick to reconsider. Several hunters and fishermen had been attacked in the area. He wanted to investigate. The game warden believed these reports because he had been attacked himself. Naturally, Rick wanted to know who would be that hostile and what his motive might be. At this point, Rick said the warden looked at him as if trying to weigh in his mind whether Rick would believe him or think he was nuts. An Indian, quote unquote, the warden said, had attacked him, narrowly missing him with an arrow. At least that's who he thought his attacker was. Although he didn't get a long look at him, his assailant was big, practically naked, dark, and visibly upset that someone was trespassing in his territory." So that is the opening part of what Rob Riggs is talking about here in the book On the Trail of the Wild Man. Now, I remember reading this years ago and thinking, man, that's kind of weird. But as I dug more into it, it got very interesting. So I'm going to continue with what Riggs had wrote. He goes into this other person. He mentioned someone of Eddie Ramirez, one of his students when he was teaching English in Beaumont. Eddie's mom had a cabin which she used for weekend retreats and fishing trips in a remote fish camp off the lower Trinity River near Trinity Bay. This was the same general area of Rick's treasure hunting experience. An old man who ran a small store and bait shop in the area told her the following story. An electrical unit lineman had been sent to a remote area bordering the swamp to make repairs. After he made the repairs and was ready to climb down from the utility pole, he was startled to find that the base of the pole was surrounded by what he described as several, quote, unquote, Indians. They glared at him menacingly for a while before disappearing into the surrounding woods. The lineman noticed they were practically naked and appeared to be very primitive. They were brandishing what seemed to be equally primitive weapons, including bows. So that is another really, really interesting report there. And could this tie into feral human reports? So Rob Riggs passed away in 2015. And my best recollection on speaking with Rob is that these reports, and there's no timeline in the book on when they were or between the late 60s and the early 1980s. He wrote the book in the early 2000s, or published a book in the early 2000s. So let's think about it. Is it possible that there could be lost tribes people? When I say lost, not contacted normally by humans, living in Texas? That is a very hard pill to swallow. Naturally, I would just say no, because, for example, people have to use fire. And there's not like fires in the woods all the time or little campsites found everywhere. Um, but, if this was 40 years ago, that area wasn't nearly as developed. And maybe there were a few people that survived in that area, because it's interesting because he ties them into the Karankawa, who many believe had cannibal tendencies and were the ones who lived along that part of the Gulf Coast. And it's just a really interesting thing. But I'm going to read you a little bit more. You can hear the rest of this on Dark Outdoors, the podcast. And it's just some really crazy stuff here. A Houston businessman named Tom Dillman provided another independent source. Tom was beachcombing near the mouth of Trinity Bay when his metal detector, when he by chance met another prospector whom he had known from previous outings. Tom mentioned he would take an airboat upstream from the mouth of the bay into the swamps and bayous that empty into Trinity River to look for a legendary pirate ship said to have shipwrecked along in the area. The other prospector told Tom that if he did so, he should take precautions. He knew of people who had been attacked by Indians there. Tom asked why the victims thought they had been attacked by Indians rather than a bunch of drug-crazed survivalist hippies, because they had been attacked by a bow and arrow, the man said, and the arrows and the Indians themselves were very primitive looking. So, man, that's just really wild stuff. It's one book, but he documented names. One person wanted to go anonymously. The other people were okay with their names being used, which lends some amount of credibility. So does this tie into the feral human phenomenon? And could there still be, or could there have been 40 years ago, Karankawas or ancient peoples living in these areas? It's theoretically possible, but improbable. The other thing I thought was, could there have been people from the modern era trying to go live as their ancestors and spending a certain amount of time in the swamps, in the woods, living as their ancestors? Is that a possibility? I am not an expert on native culture or lore, but that's just a thought, and something else I thought, were these some kind of strange survivalists, that were living off grid at the time? And, I don't know, but it's a weird story. And I think it's one that certainly deserves some attention. So I brought it back. You can download the Dark Outdoors podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and iHeartRadio, and the Amazon platform as well. And I hope you subscribe. If you subscribe to it, email me at chester@chestermore.com. That's chester@chestermore.com. And I will send you a Dark Outdoors decal. And it's a really, really cool decal with our slogan, pray, prepare, and pack heat. I do want to talk a little bit more about the feral human part of all this. I've heard some strange stories over the years. And the problem is, without documentation, it's hard to believe a lot of this stuff. Even with the Bigfoot thing, there are thousands of people talking about this, but there are only a handful think they might have seen a feral human. Actually, in Riggs' book, and Rob's been gone a long time. I never got to go down a deep talk on this with him. He asked if it would be possible that some Bigfoot reports could be some of these Karankawas that survived and lived in a wild state, because they were known to rub, I'm going to get it wrong, but some kind of a gland. What, you hear the roosters back there driving me nuts. Some kind of an animal gland or something. The stink, and Bigfoots have this smell thing, allegedly. It's an interesting topic. Have you ever heard of anyone talking about lost tribes in America? What do you think about this? This is not my opinions. This is just a book. But when people are talking about the whole thing with lost tribes and feral humans, I couldn't help but tie in what I just recently went back and revisited a Rob Riggs book about these alleged tribal things that were happening in the Trinity Bay area of Texas and the Big Thicket. And it's just one of those great mysteries. And it would definitely freak me out if I ran into someone who looked like they were living as ancient person in modern times. I don't know what would scare me more, if I ran into them and they were legitimately living like that, or someone who wanted to go back from the modern era and live like that. It's totally interesting thought. So if you've ever heard of any stories like this, put them in the comments below, or email me at chester@chestermore.com. I don't know what to think, but I do know it's interesting. And when there's smoke, there's fire. So there must be something to these old stories, and I'm trying to dig more out about them. Don't forget, download and subscribe to the Dark Outdoors podcast. Dark Outdoors is on all podcasting platforms. You can just go to darkoutdoorspodcast.com and see all the different links. Hope you guys have a great day.